Welcome to another philosophy lecture. In this video lecture, I will present the problem of universals. Have you ever thought about it? What is a game? What makes you say that something is a game? There must be something in common, right? But what's in common among all the games? Think about a game such as Ring Around the Rosie and the Russian roulette and poker. What exactly is in common among these things? Think about other games like football or any video games. It's hard to say, isn't it? Furthermore, think about what's in common among cats or any animal. Cats come in completely different shapes and forms, and yet there's something about them that makes you say and recognize what a cat is. Or another example, red things. The red tomatoes, balloons, flowers, cherries, shoes, crayons. What exactly is in common? Well, probably redness. And for cat is catness. Well, this is the idea of you're starting to see the problem of universals. There are particular things that we know. There are objects, people, animals. They cannot be in more than one place at a time. An apple is an apple and it's there. On the other hand, there are universals. For example, games, catness, redness, the color red. These things seem to be attributes that can be, or properties that can be in different places at the same time. Now, among particulars, there are things and objects, people. Among universals or attributes, there can be properties such as color and shape and hardness, or kinds. For example, biological species of dogs, cats, or genera like animals and plants and elements, or even relations. Next to, a mile from, between, and all these relations among things. Or the relation between a father and a son and a father. So some can be symmetrical, some asymmetrical. Now, of course, this idea of the universal properties, universal kinds, and so on, right off the bat, it creates some problems when it comes to causation. Now, the idea is, how can these universal properties, which are abstract, cause particulars in the physical world to participate in redness or baldness or whatever that might be? This is an old problem. How is it possible that a non-material thing can exert some sort of a causal connection power upon physical? But other people say, but are universals really that strange? After all, in modern science, we used to hear things like Higgs boson, quarks, atoms, and other strange particles. And it doesn't seem that universals are much, much stranger than those entities, scientific entities. So Why should we be so against them when, after all, just like scientific entities explain the world, universals also explain the world. Meaning and knowledge, for example. Universal explain meaning. When I say red, wise, the number 3, okay, if red is a description of red things, but red is a subjective feature of the world that I invented, then ultimately, when I say any sentence that contains the word red, such as, for example, the apple is red, my sentence, the apple is red, would be false. Why? Because it doesn't, because you see, truth requires meaning, and meaning requires reference to something. So if the word red doesn't refer to anything, then the sentence is false. Some people argue. Of course, nominalists, other people say, no, that's not true. We can make a meaning because those things are red. What do you mean by red? Now, universals also explain knowledge. Knowledge versus opinion. If things are red just by some brute fact that they're red by some accident, then that is not knowledge. It's only based on an accident. Knowledge must be based on something that is universal, objective, and in fact mind independent. For example, the fact that James Brown is dead now is not just a mere opinion, but it's based on a fact that is universal. In other words, it is mind independent even. Also, universals explain morality's objectivity. For example, torturing innocent people for fun is wrong, full stop. And this seems to be a universally recognized and in fact an objective and a mind-independent recognized moral value. But if such value is just an opinion, then how do we make sense of the fact that everyone recognizes that torturing innocent people for fun is wrong, full stop? There are many theories that explain universals or explain away universals. Realism, nominalism, conceptualism, fictionalism. Now, starting with realism. Realism have different forms. In my lectures on Plato's metaphysics, we saw the Plato's theory of forms, okay? For example, there are many things that participate in, say, redness. Okay, many things that are red, or many individuals that participate in the form of friendship. They might be friends. Okay, two individuals might be friends, but that is not friendship. Friendship is something that doesn't look like Joe and Francesca, for example. Okay? Friendship is an abstract concept that gives the essence of friendship to two individuals, for example. Plato believes that these are forms that are immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and so red apples participate in various forms, the form of apple and the form of red or redness. Aristotle was also a realist, a strong realist. Aristotle, however, didn't believe that universals, essences, concepts are abstract entities. He believed that these entities are in nature. As a matter of fact, if you see the fresco, the School of Athens, you see that Plato's pointing upward to the sky, meaning the forms, different realm, different world where these belong. Whereas you see the picture of Aristotle doing this with his hand, meaning the essences of things are in the things themselves, are in nature. So tallness, for example, redness, roundness, those are qualities, universal qualities that exist in space and time in the objects. Here's an objection. Universals are too weird. They're too strange. They seem contrived. And in fact, we can use Occam's razor, which says, do not multiply entities without necessity. And why should we say that besides red objects in the world, there's also this thing known as redness out there? Maybe there is no redness. It's better to use Occam's razor and shave off the unnecessary multiplied entities. Another objection is Aristotle himself, who says that this is known as the third man objection. This was an objection to Plato's realism. If a man is a man because he is an example of the form, the abstract form of man, then you need a third form, hence the third man, to explain how a man and the form of man are both man. There must be something else against which you have to compare them. You say, well, what's in common between the form of man and man? There must be something that explains the commonality. Now, when you explain it in terms of the third form, now you're going to need a fourth one, because you have to explain how the form that explains the commonality between the form of man and man are alike. Well, this leads to an infinite regress. It makes no sense. There's also a linguistic objection. Take, for example, the sentence, "The rat is gray." Is it true? Well, it's true if there is a gray rat, and that means that the rat would participate in the form of grayness. So in other words, it is true because of another statement. The statement, "The rat exemplifies grayness." But what makes this sentence, "The rat exemplifies grayness," true? It must be another sentence. The rat is an example of the exemplification of grayness. But what makes this sentence true? It must be yet another sentence. And once again, we have the infinite regress. Now, consider now the property does not exemplify itself. What satisfies it? Well, those things that do not exemplify themselves. For example, the concept of being the Pope is not the Pope. The concept of roadkill is not itself a roadkill. On the other hand, there are properties that exemplify themselves. For example, the property of being incorporeal is incorporeal, so it satisfies itself. It exemplifies itself. And the property of being self-identical is self-identical. Okay? But what about the property does not exemplify itself? Not being an example of itself. Okay? Now call this property non-self-exemplifying. The question is, does it exemplify itself or not? If the property non-self-exemplifying is an example of itself, you see, it is not an example of itself because it is the property of a thing that does not exemplify itself. But if the property non-self-exemplify is not an example of itself, then it follows that it is an example of itself because it is the self-property, it is the property of a thing that does not exemplify itself. Now this sounds like a tongue twister, but you can rewind the video and watch it and think about it. So it is crazy, and so it seems that there are things, there would be forms that are completely absurd, that exemplify themselves and not exemplify themselves. What's the explanation? Well, some people put some restrictions, okay? These paradoxes occur when we don't put restrictions. And according to some realists, you have to restrict these entities. So the rat is gray because it partakes in grayness. Full stop. You can't explain it with a further sentence. And not all properties exist. For example, non-self-exemplifying is not a universal property. But what is it then? Also, with regard to regress ad infinitum, some realists say, look, when I explain, for example, that the mouse is gray, in terms of a universal grayness, that should be the end of the story, okay? Why is grayness and the mouse the same? Because of some other universals? Maybe, maybe not. However, the realist claims to have explained why the rat is gray. That's an explanation, okay? The rat is gray because it participates in grayness. But why is that? Well, that's another question. I gave you an explanation. I don't know if this is satisfactory. If you accept the regress, there are too many universals anyway. And if you don't accept it, then there's no explanation. Also, more restrictions. Consider the term bachelor, okay? According to realism, there must be a form of bachelor. But which universal is that? Presumably, the universal of being a bachelor. But what does that mean to be a bachelor? To be a bachelor is to be a male, unmarried human being. Too many properties. Why should we multiply these properties? So, we need the property of human for a human, the property of unmarried for an unmarried, and the property of man for a man. Why do we need a bachelor? We can explain being a bachelor with the properties of an unmarried man. In fact, why do we need the negative property, unmarried? Why not just say that a bachelor is someone who lacks a certain property of being married? So it gets confusing. Now, there are defined and undefined universals. For example, triangularity is the property of having three angles. But there are undefined properties like bachelor. What does that mean to be a bachelor? Now, you would say, well, the bachelor is that person, the person who is not married. But what does that mean? It's not like showing a triangle. So the triangle shows you the property of triangularity. So the problem is, who decides the definition of these universals? There are two kinds of anti-realism. Nominalism and conceptualism. Nominalism says that no universals exist. Individuals explain everything. Conceptualism, on the other hand, says that individuals alone do not explain everything because you need also concepts of ideas. There is a form of nominalism known as predicate nominalism. This says, when I say that Tom is red, by is red, I mean it's true of Tom and can be true of Bob, Jeff, and other people, or other objects. So only individuals and words exist. But the obvious objection is that what exactly makes it true that Bob, Tom, Jeff, and others are red? What's in common among all these objects? It can't be just words. The predicate is red applies only to certain individuals anyway. So it can't be words. Now, realism explains why sentences are true. Courage is a virtue, triangularity is a shape, red is a color. Because they pick out a referent universal that exists. Otherwise, the sentences are false, as we noted earlier. But another form of nominalism, known as austere nominalism, says that sentences are in disguise. And so there's a way for us to explain meaning without universals. And this is the following. Those sentences are disguised ways to refer to particulars, really. So in the end, all that exists is particulars. There aren't universals. Talk that involves universals is a disguised way of talking about particulars. Socrates exemplifies courage, means simply that Socrates is courageous. Plato exemplifies wisdom, means Plato is wise. Okay? And similarly, for example, many objects are red. Same story. This particular object is red. That particular object is red. So statements are true because they refer to particular instances. So when I say courage, I don't mean a form, a universal form. I always mean something particular. This woman is courageous. So austere nominalism claims that it's possible to translate any sentence into a particular sentence. Courage is a virtue. Courageous persons are morally virtuous. Triangularity is a shape, but I don't mean a form. I mean triangular objects are shaped objects, and so on. However, those statements do not seem to be the same as their proposed translations. For example, courage is a virtue. It's true, right? But its translation, courageous persons are morally virtuous. It's not the same because courageous persons may not be morally virtuous. So the sentence could be false. So courage is a virtue cannot be false, but courageous persons are morally virtuous can be false. Consequently, they cannot be an equivalent. So the original sentence can be true while the translation be false. How do you explain that then? Furthermore, how do you translate that tomato, and that fire engine have the same color? How do you particularize such a sentence? Or he has the same character trait as his cousin. These seem to commit us to to the existence of something universal instead of particular. But even if you could, how would you translate some species are cross-fertile? That shape has been exemplified many times. So there are a lot of sentences that resist that kind of translation. Now there's also a resemblance nominalism, which says that an individual redness is explained by a thing that belongs to the set of red things. This sounds strange. So membership in a particular set defines what is red, what is pizza, what is man, what is a dog. It defines what it means to have a certain property. Now, but everything that has a heart has a kidney, okay? This is one set. Consequently, belonging to this set means that having a heart and having a kidney is the same property. But this is actually false. Furthermore, resemblance nominalism suggests that we form sets and put in them things that resemble each other. Now, how do we do that? We must have a concept of resemblance. What does that mean to resemble? Red in apples resembles red in traffic lights. Also, yellow apples resemble red apples. But then resemblance nominalism explains resemblance of red by reference to things that are not red, which would be absurd. Now, granted, you can make a set of things that are only red. Okay, so you don't have to put the yellow apple and the red apple in the same set. However, you would have to say that being red means being in the set of red things. Fine. In other words, being red is exemplified by, guess what? Being red. But what does red mean? Furthermore, what is resemblance? If particular objects, it needs an explanation. But if universal, then there are at least some universal properties that would explain resemblance. Another form of nominalism is trope nominalism. Trope nominalism says that individuals are bundles of tropes. Okay, so my cell phone, a book, an apple, they're just bundles of tropes. Where are these tropes? For example, an apple is a complex bundle of tropes. A red trope, a sweet trope, an apple-shaped trope. Red is not a property of red trope, but rather of red itself. This sounds strange too. So trope nominalism says qualitative identity is due to the individuals having tropes. They are qualitative identical, but numerically different. For example, a red car has red trope 1, and a red apple has red trope 2, and a red cherry, red trope 3. But they don't resemble because of universal red. They resemble because they have trope resemblance. Okay, if that makes any sense. Now, think about this set with red 1, red 2, red 3, and red 4. They resemble each other more closely than other tropes. So tropes have only one property. Now, members that are not red would not go into a set of tropes. So resemblance among individual tropes means that red 1 resemble resembles red 2, red 2, red 3, red 3, red 1. So resemblance between 3 apples is just like resemblance among tropes. This sounds very suspicious. Now think about it. You have a red car, a red apple, and a red cherry. They resemble each other because they have tropes. The resemblance, they have tropes, and these tropes resemble each other. But why do these tropes resemble each other? What is that resemblance? Is it just accidental? If there is a resemblance, there must be a universal principle, right? Or you would have to say, well, they just do resemble. But what is resemblance? Now, the last one is conceptualism. Conceptualism says generality is a feature of our minds. Just our minds, that's the way that our minds work and categorize things. Our minds generalize things. There's nothing out there. It's just in here. So, for example, you have a group where set, red lights, and red apples. So the concept of redness applies to both. It's a concept, conceptualism. It's a concept of the mind. So for conceptualism, red or redness is a general, not because it denotes a mind-independent reality or an entity that exists outside space and time, but rather because many particulars conform, so many particular objects in the world conform to the concept red, the conceptual scheme of red in our minds. But think about it. How do we apply the concept without a general guide? How does this concept in our minds apply to particular objects in the world? We could name things arbitrarily and call a green apple a red apple or a squirrel. So it seems that there is something in common among red things that is mind independent. It's not the concept that is applied, but there's something that we recognize in the objects that perhaps creates our mental concepts. Another theory is fictionalism. And this fictionalism says the way we treat abstract entities like red, like justice, is by talking in terms of fiction. Just like when you read a Shakespeare or any other character. Aeneas sailed for Troy to Italy. Okay? Achilles slew Hector. Now, these are false statements. They're false because these things don't exist. But in the context of the fictional context, in the context of these stories, these sentences are true. Okay? And that's how you treat universal abstract entities. So 2 + 2 = 4 is literally false because it doesn't apply to reality, but it applies to the story of mathematics. So presumably, according to fictionalism, courage is a virtue and red is a color, are sentences that are literally false, okay? Because there's no red form or red or courage. But they are true when we consider them within the story of... Within what story? How do you fictionalize courage is a virtue, red is a color? That's the problem. Well, this is the end of the lecture. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lecture.